Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. We're your co hosts, Jordan.
And Sam.
So, we can be pretty critical of school on this podcast. And also, as we've seen many times during COVID, for instance, school can be a safer place for kids. It's where they get meals, it's where teachers and friends and many other people in the school building care for them, where they care for each other, and so on.
But that doesn't mean that building safer spaces in schools is a bland, neutral, apolitical thing. Schools are always political places, and students arrive with politicized identities.
And in her recent book, Sanctuary Schools, today's guest, Chandler Miranda, looks with nuance and care at the active collective work that it takes to make and maintain educational sanctuary for immigrant youth.
And so during our conversation, Dr. Miranda touches on schoolscapes, affinity spaces, and what it means to build and do sanctuary with immigrant youth in this moment of extreme repression. So without further ado, let's listen to our conversation with Dr. Miranda.
Dr. Chandler Miranda, welcome to Another Education is Possible. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Maybe you could just start by sharing a little bit about who you are and what brings you to this work on sanctuary that we're going to really heavily focus on in our conversation.
Sure. So I'm currently an assistant professor of education and educational leadership at Malloy University, where I work with mid-career educators to teach them research methods to help them figure out how to understand educational research and to apply it to their own context. But before I came to this job, I was a high school science teacher. I worked both in San Benito, Texas, which is a little town between Harlingen and Brownsville on the US-Mexico border, and also in Barranquilla and Bogota, Colombia, where I worked at private schools for very privileged kids in Colombia. And so teaching in both those contexts, on paper, my students would look really similar demographically using US ways that we think about race, ethnicity, and language, but we're coming to their educational context with very, very different backgrounds. But both of these groups of students were crossing borders for educational purposes. And so I came back to NYU to study really transmigration in terms of how much people relied on border crossing for schooling opportunities and how much different parts of their identity, like race, ethnicity, nationality, socioeconomic status, played into their ability to access and take advantage of education systems in different places.
So building off of that work and looking at schools as sanctuaries, part of what you describe within your work is the schoolscape. And so we were wondering if you could describe what a schoolscape is and what that looks like in relation to schools as sanctuaries.
Sure. So when I came back to study at NYU, I had been a teacher in 3 different schools. I'd visited many, many more schools. I'd worked for 4 different principals. I'd gone to public schools myself. I had been in enough schools to where when you walk into it, you get that feeling of this is a good place for kids or this is a bad place for kids. And so when I came to New York City, I continued to visit schools. And when I walked into my first international high school, I got this kind of spidey sense where it was kind of the two worlds that I had grown my interest in studying kind of collided. So these were schools that were specifically made for the most marginalized students in US public schools, older immigrant students who'd often had separation from family or separation from school, who are coming to high school with the lowest proficiency on English exams in the state. This is the group of kids that are the least likely to graduate in the whole country. And walking into a school and it feeling like, 1, a safe place, 2, a happy and joyful place, and 3, like the kind of space where rigorous education and deep learning was happening, which is what I was accustomed to seeing in more privileged spaces. So project-based learning, kids were given agency and responsibility There was dialogue between students and teachers all the time. And so the more of these schools I visited, the more I realized that this was a component piece of how these schools were built. And so in the book, I kind of bring you through a student's first day and his recognition that this school was a different feeling kind of place. And I really struggled with what to call this. I think there's been a lot of attention paid right now to built environment, to think about how a school design and office design and just kind of the spaces that we're in. But it wasn't just about what the school looked like or felt like without people in it, although that is a component part, an important part of what I described as this kind of innovation in sanctuary. But it's also like a landscape. You've got the topography, but then you have the living things in it, the social environment that make it complete. And so I describe the schoolscape of the school both as kind of these built environment pieces. So it's a small school, it's one hallway, it's impossible to get lost or be invisible in this space. There's not rows of desks, there's kind of no clear front of a classroom, it's tables. It looks collaborative. Everything that is on the bulletin boards is multilingual, multicultural, representative of where the students are from and what they bring to the school. There's not really kind of exceptional work on the bulletin board, but all of these kind of works in progress. So showing a project at different stages, showing what annotation looks like. It looked and felt distinct. And then of course, the way it sounded, right? So the speaking of many languages, the joyfulness of kids, the collegiality, all of these things as an anthropologist kind of tweaked my interest and made me pay attention. And it became really my job at that point to try to understand that why all of that existed at the cultural level. What were the things that allowed for the conditions that created a space that was a joyful place for teachers and students, even as, and at the study started in 2016, even as the outside environment of the school became more and more hostile towards immigrant communities.
So you're really painting such a clear picture of the feeling, the sense of joy and inclusion and care that's present here. I'm wondering though if you could take a step back and show us, because all of these things sound both familiar, things like work being hung on the walls, but then also strange to the dominant way that we do schooling in the United States. Things like multiple languages flourishing in a classroom, project-based learning, which is certainly present and probably familiar to many educators, but it's not the way the majority of things are done. So I think, of course, if folks are interested in finding out like the deep specifics, I highly encourage them to read your book, Sanctuary School, which I should also note came out from Harvard Ed Press, but contract was signed. I know that the full manuscript was submitted before some really not okay things happened with Harvard Ed Press, including the suppression of Palestinian voices and the cancellation of a special issue of Harvard Ed Review, but we can save that for another conversation. But could you really take us into kind of what you might call the everyday rhythms of a school like IHS? What does it actually look like? Is there a first period? Are students organized into a classroom? Do they take tests? Things like that.
Yeah, actually, that's one of the reasons that I came to this school. So when I started this study, the internationals high schools were some of the high schools in New York City and New York State that are given a waiver where they don't have to take the Regents exam. I don't know, at this point in time, I think 26 states had this type of exit exam that you had to pass in order to get your high school diploma. This has changed quite significantly since COVID. Many states are moving away from this, including New York State, which I believe should be passing the portrait of a graduate that'll allow schools to move away from this type of standardized testing. But when I started this study, the school where I was doing it was getting that waiver really for the first time. And so when I entered the school, I was really interested in looking at the impact of moving away from standardized high stakes assessment and to using portfolio assessments, or what they called PBAT, at the school, at how that impacted the daily workings of the school and the way that students were able to learn. They would have said that before that they did projects before, but the pressure of having to pass 6 Regents exams. It's distinct in terms of even just the time it takes to do all of that testing, right? And so that was one of the reasons I chose the school to study. This was pre-election of Donald Trump the first time. And so that had kind of been the focus of my prospectus and my proposal, was to look at this process of projects through performance assessment, which included an oral exam for students. So that was kind of the context for entering the school. Can you repeat the second part of the question?
Yeah, really, I think I'm just wondering, like, tell us, what does a school day look like? Because so much of this might sound foreign to listeners, and I think they wonder, like, is there an ELA class? Do they have studio art class? Things, is there a 45-minute class or maybe a block schedule of class? Are there grades? Things like that.
Really good question. Yes. So when you walk in on day one, 9th and 10th graders are enrolled in cohort that stay together for a full 2 years. And then they are assigned to a team, an interdisciplinary team of teachers that they stay with for full 2 years. This is really atypical in the American high school, right? Like usually you get your individual schedule to get your individual credits, and you move from class to class as an individual. This is more like what you would see in a typical elementary school, where you're grouped with the same 20 to 25 students all day, and you move from class to class with them, or class to specials with them. And what I really found was that this cohorting allowed students to build trusting relationships with peers really quickly, and trusting relationships with teachers really quickly, in a way that you wouldn't see if they had been kind of dispersed, 100 students circling to different classes. One of the things I also write about in the book is kind of the careful and creative calculus that went into planning the school day. So if you are designated as an English learner in New York City high schools, or any high schools, although it differs from state to state, you are mandated a certain amount of hours of English immersion or English kind of contact. But the school really valued giving students access to high level, rigorous content. And so what they had to do is kind of think creatively about how to have somebody with the right certification in the room for enough hours while still allowing students to have access to high quality instruction in math, science, the humanities, digital media, all art, all of the kind of electives that typically English learners don't get access to because they're in these pull-out classes where they're learning like cat, dog, bat, rat, those kinds of things. And so when you walk into the school, you have these kind of classrooms that are grouped together, and all of these kids rotating from class to class in these classrooms. The teachers share classrooms and then meet in lunch in a classroom, like geographically located in the school, all within a very kind of small environment, even within this small school. What's also interesting about this is because teaching isn't from the front of the classroom, it's more of a facilitation. 10th graders play a really important role in socializing 9th graders and supporting them on their learning journey. So every 10th grader has been in that same position as the 9th grader, new to the school, new to the country, new to the language, and really act as kind of facilitators and guides alongside teachers to facilitate learning and engagement. As you move down the hallway, from the front office, which actually the cover of the book is a mural inside of the school. It's one of the first things that you see, which I just really love about it. As you move down that hallway, then you move into the 11th and 12th grade. And those 11th and 12th grade aren't grouped together anymore, but they still maintain that cohorting for the 11th grade and cohorting for the 12th grade. I've had participants say to me like, well, when we first started school, we don't talk to anybody who doesn't have the same language or isn't from the same country as us. But by the 12th grade, we know each other's horoscopes. And I was just in a professional development this week, actually, with one of the teachers from the school, watching her talk about her practice. And so most schools, this is another structure that I think is really typical in the high school setting, would be like a do now. How do you start off your class? You have your objectives on the board, you have a do now for students. Sometimes it's graded. They do a little journal entry and you turn it in, you get a grade. It's supposed to help students get to class on time, remind them of what they learned, and set you up to do your lesson well. But what was really interesting about what she did is that it was a do now with a social component to it, because one of her real focuses is not just getting students to do the work or to learn the content, but to begin to create a social atmosphere of community in which students know each other. So the students will come in, they'll write their journal, and then they will have to find a partner. And she has this list of find somebody who has the same color sneaker as you, has the same birthday month as you. She said she has a list of 100, right, of different ways to get to know each other in the classroom. So kids have to stand up, talk to each other, move around, and then share out what their partner believed about the prompt, which I had never seen that before. In all my years of research and teaching, that social component to a do now. And that's really built into everything. So you have like the content sentence starters, and you've got the vocab and whatever. But you also have these pages that are taped to the table that say, I'd like to build on what Jose said, and I'd like to add to what this, or I'd like to invite this person to speak about this concept. So really building in invitations to engage into both the physical schoolscape, like what you see in the classrooms, and then also in how interactions are encouraged. And so people really describe this as kind of like loud, joyful engagement that in other places could look like, misbehaviors. It's not like rows of desks and quiet students with their pencils and paper, right? It looks and feels very different.
It sounds like it's maybe productive chaos and
Very productive
joyful.
chaos. And then I'll add one other thing is like the classes are really always active. There's movement, there's, engagement. And then one time of day, all the doors close. It gets really quiet. Lights are dimmed, tables are pushed aside, and kids sit on the floor. And that's another kind of part of that schoolscape is the creation of an advisory class that's really, really meaningful, in which they do a lot of the social emotional work, trauma informed work, creating kind of the spaces where students can share about the things that are challenging to them, from family reunification or just regular teenage stuff like boyfriend girlfriend problems to undocumented status and fears of family deportation. It's where a lot of the things that come up that then the school is able to respond to emerge. And then finally, there's one other morning of the day where no one comes to schools except for the 11th and 12th graders. And they work in small groups for mentoring to prepare for PBATs, and where every adult in the school, from the gym teacher to the principal, are paired with students as mentors and mentees to do that hard academic work of taking a classroom project and turning it into a graduation level project that then they're able to engage in an oral exam about. So there's all of these little kind of like component parts, but each of them plays a really important role in the larger culture of the school.
So I'm being an awful host, but this sounds like such a magical school, and I'm realizing that I haven't asked you to really frame it. And possibly that's because I think maybe this is self-aggrandizing, but I think our work is in deep conversation with each other.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
So for those who aren't doing this work in New York City, could you maybe just frame like what is this school? Because this is part of a very well-known, very successful network that started in New York, is now national. But so you call your school IHS or International High School, but what is the larger network? And just very briefly, what is the history of that?
Sure. So the Internationals Network for Public Schools is a nonprofit organization that serves as an intermediate organization for the schools. The school started in 1985 with the International High School at LaGuardia Community College. And it started by radical, innovative educators who saw a group of students who were being marginalized and underserved in traditional school settings and thought that they could do something better. And so this very first school is where some of the practices that remain today emerge. A lot has changed, but I think any school where you are treating students as fully human, investing in them as capable, radically welcoming them to the school and to the country, and helping them navigate some of these complicated institutional aspects of things, you're going to get good results. I think we know that from the literature. It's always surprising to us researchers why it's so much harder to create those spaces than it is to write about how they are possible. And so the school had great success, but this was also a moment in time in which we were kind of entering into a moment of innovation and experimentation and education in the 90s in New York, with the Coalition of Essential Schools, and the leadership and administrations at that time were really receptive to things like project-based learning. And so in this moment of innovation, 2 new schools opened. They formed this nonprofit organization to help support the schools, to help kind of be a place where the knowledge about why these schools had such wonderful outcomes with students lived, and to help kind of grow the movement. When I talk about networks of schools, I think that conjures for many people things like KIPP or like Success Academy, where a really corporate model was employed to create these schools that could be staffed by pretty much anyone, mostly young women right out of places like Barnard and the small liberal arts colleges of the Northeast, where they were given a script and told exactly what to teach, and then they were supposed to get results that were measured by testing. That's not what this network is at all. It emerged from the idea that teachers are professionals, that each school would have some of the same principles in their approach to education. They call it the hello model. So talking about heterogeneity, not leveling students, content language integration, not pulling students out, one learning model for all. Student and teacher learning mirrors each other. So teachers do portfolios, students do portfolios. Teachers engage in projects, students engage in projects. Every professional development to this day, 20 some odd years later, since the formation of the actual nonprofit, are still teacher-run professional developments. And so they adopted this kind of philosophy model, whole school model, and approach to learning that was replicated in each school, but looked different depending on context, and then grew slowly. So I think they work with about 70 districts now, but they took a lot of those stats down just to kind of protect their schools. But they have whole school models in New York City and DC and California, and there's a new one that just opened in the Southwest. And each of them kind of are built on these core ideas. So there are other schools in New York City that are newcomer programs. There's lots of quote unquote newcomer programs throughout the whole country. These existed before and are kind of coming back now. Short and Boyson did a study of them in 2013. That's interesting. But with No Child Left Behind, a lot of these programs closed, and because they couldn't show the testing progress that was necessary to stay open. But Internationals was able to sustain its whole school independent model. Now they have some academies and things like that are kind of, again, it depends on geographic context. But they've shown over time is that they are able to sustain their model regardless of the sociopolitical environment. And what I argue in the book is it's because of the deep knowledge of the schools, the deep investment in teacher development, the kind of ways in which they're able to keep teachers for many times their whole career. Alums come back to work in the school, moms, aunties, cousins, siblings come back to work in the school. One of the schools that just opened is by a principal who had opened a former school and brought several teachers with her. And one of them is a sister-brother pair, the brother born in the United States, the sister who had gone to one of the international schools herself. So yeah, it started as an idea and it has grown into a movement, but one rooted in grassroots organizing and authentic relationships.
Yeah. And essentially, as you show, the idea that these schools function as sanctuaries, the possibility, and I love when people say the title of a movie in a movie, so that they might be sanctuary schools, to use the title of your book directly. But also you bring in a lot of tensions about how this is not super easy. So I want to read a quote from your book. You talk about, I'm going to quote here, the challenge of providing a safe, supportive environment while also worrying about what will happen to students after graduation in college and the quote unquote real world. This concern is common among educators in counter spaces that shield students from a harsh reality that their teachers fear they may enter unprepared, end quote. So I guess that leaves me wondering, how did the school in which you conducted your research navigate that tension? And maybe in your answer, you could tease out a little bit about what a counterpublic is and how they offered things like internship programs, and just expanding on some of the work they did to balance both sanctuary and quote unquote real world.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the reasons I started using the word sanctuary was because in 2016, there were only about 9 municipalities in the United States that had called themselves sanctuary. A lot of these were kind of holdover from the sanctuary movement of the 1980s in the United States. But by the end of 2017, there were over 600 municipalities that had identified as sanctuaries. And schools and school districts and universities were using this word often in their declarations to try to show support of immigrant communities. But what I noticed when I started looking at these declarations, that a lot of them were really focused on this idea of protectionism, right? Of this idea of keeping student data safe, of keeping ICE off campus. And so when I started saying, I think sanctuary is more than this, I got some pushback. I got on one hand, every school is a sanctuary. That's what schools are. On the other hand, I got schools cannot be sanctuary because they have long and dark histories of colonialization and genocide, and so therefore can't be described as sanctuaries. I was told, well, they can't be sanctuaries because you can't take sanctuary in them like you would a church. You can't go live in a school. And so a lot of pushback on the use of this word. And so I found counterpublic a helpful frame for trying to just describe that juxtaposition I was making between the very, very important part of sanctuary that rests in protectionism, but goes beyond student data and keeping ICE off campus, and then moves into kind of innovation and thinking about the sanctuary as less static than what I think a lot of the declarations made it seem like. So when we think about counterpublics, and when I think about this idea of sanctuary and radical welcome, is that if you think about in traditional schools, how youth develop skills and identities and critique, they can begin to see themselves in different lights. And so we know that many students, especially older students who are English learners in schools, experience non-belonging, isolation, silencing, and othering. And so I tried to juxtapose those themes in the literature with the idea of counterpublics. And so I used sanctuary to really think about schools that are specific counterpublics that shield students from anti-immigrant discourses and help them create critiques of the system to be able to kind of speak truth to power and speak back to that rhetoric.
That's super, super fascinating stuff. And I think within this sanctuary space, one thing that's important to navigate is politicized funds of knowledge, the ways in which students are bringing in knowledge that schools should build upon, regardless of whether this fits traditional hierarchies and norms, wherein this knowledge would be considered dangerous or undesirable or unwelcome. So thinking about the real world experiences and political contexts that shape immigrant youth's experiences when they're coming into these schools and how these may differ from the knowledge that is traditionally taught in a classroom. And so how do these schools navigate these funds of knowledge and create a space of unconditional belonging?
I'm thinking about a lot of different things right now. So let me think about the students specifically. I write about, especially in the conclusion, that mindset shift that I think educators need to have in order to create a sanctuary school, in which there's a lot of reframing that's necessary in terms of seeing immigrant youth from an assets-based perspective. We talk about it all the time, but if you listen to educators talk about immigrant students and English learners specifically, it's often from a really deficit place. That idea is that monolingual American ideology lives deep in our school system, right? This idea that you cannot learn until you learn English, that you have a barrier to learning if you don't speak English. And I think what I really saw at this school was a restructuring or reprioritization of what knowledges were seen as important, and English was deprioritized. So while English was still important and was the lingua franca of the school, because students were coming from all over the world, it was less important than feeling safe, feeling cared for, feeling a sense of belonging, maintaining native language and culture, and engaging in high level content through translanguaging. So I think like that rethinking of what knowledges are the most important and what do we value. And then also the way that projects were created either spoke to student lived experiences directly or were bridges to understanding things like racialized histories in the United States, for example, to where it really helped students generate the vocabulary to describe things like racialization, marginalization, xenophobia, and then see those connections between kind of what their experience was in the United States now, their experience of border crossing and journeying, and how it related to structural elements in our society. So that was one thing. I think on the other hand, when I talk about the one learning model for all and how teacher development mirrored student learning, in chapter 4, I talk a lot about how much time and care is invested into helping teachers shift mindsets, learn a new way of teaching, engage in project-based learning. And one of the other things that I think was an interesting shift at this time was this kind of grammar of schooling or way in which we approach schooling, where teachers are expected to be politically neutral, unbiased civil servants. And I think that's really shifting now. And I think it's shifting in other places, but I certainly saw it in this school, that shift of, I need to teach the election in a fair and balanced way, to my silence about the anti-immigrant rhetoric that's happening now is not something like that I can do anymore, that I have to let my students know that I don't stand with anyone who says anti-immigrant things, for example. So I think those are two ways in which I saw that really play out in the school.
Yeah, and so I think you're really talking a lot here about the unsilencing that's occurring and how these traditional school hierarchies are being disrupted, a very active process and continual process in making this safe space for students and teachers and faculty. You've touched a little bit on the role that teachers and other leaders may play, but what other roles may they play in creating this sanctuary environment for students?
Yeah, I mean, there's the inside of the school and the outside of the school. And the more I spend time learning about the network, the more I realize that there's this kind of interplay and buffering in all of these. So, I mean, I think that within the school leader in particular plays an incredibly important role in navigating creative, we could call it lots of different things, but creative compliance, creative non-compliance, creative resistance. And so I really saw that happening. Particularly, I read about Laura a lot. She's the only person who's named in the book, Laura and Clara Sylvan, because we keep the geographic location of the school safe. We had to change that kind of post-election to just make sure that we were trying to protect the space. But Laura is a real person and is the executive director of internationals now. And she would kind of joke that every few years the school would get on a list because of the Regents test scores or some other way of measuring like ninth grade progress or things that didn't really make sense because they would, for example, take just the race and ethnicity of students, not considering that they were new to the country, and compare them, to kids of the same race and ethnicity who were born in the United States. And the school would get on a list. And so she would talk about, what it would look like to invite people into the school to see the work, to feel the things that I was talking about in the schoolscape, get off the list, and then know that they were going to have to deal with that again and again. And so there was a management of bureaucracy rather than a total bucking of the system, right? It wasn't like, we're going to go charter or this isn't going to work for us. They were like, we're going to work within demographic systems. We're going to do it in really creative ways. And one of the things I talk about is this idea, especially for leaders, of compliance versus doing what's best for students. And it should make sense that those two things shouldn't be incongruent, but they often are. And so leaders really were kind of doing that work, figuring out how to put students first, figuring out what had to be complied to and what had wiggle room to try to kind of flip it on its head to make it work for students. So I think in the scheduling to give teachers planning time and the scheduling to give students access to high quality content, those kinds of things. On the other side though, and this is kind of where the international comes in, is that over the history of the network, they've done things that have not only helped the students that are able to go to their schools, but helped students across the state and across the country be valued for what they bring to schools. So for example, the Seal of Biliteracy in New York City, the advocacy for that, there were many, many internationals, affiliated people who played a role in advocating for this seal, that if you are bilingual when you graduate from high school, as their students are, and as many students are, you can do things like get credit for that in college. And there's one that is coming out around the Regents exam. There's exemptions for the Regents exam. So you can get the superintendent's waiver for Regents exam if your principal writes about a life experience, a death in the family or an illness or something that kept you from doing as well on the exam as you could. And they were able to advocate to get migration in as a life event that could exempt them from particular exams. So there's all of this work at the policy and advocacy level that's happening that benefit students broadly, but also makes the schools more capable of doing the work they want to do. And I think, again, a really good example of this is in the project-based learning, is in the performance assessment and portfolio assessments, when you're not beholden to state exams, that allows space for innovation and creativity. So I don't know if that answers the question fully, but I think that there's so many aspects of it over time and happening kind of at the same time that the buffering and the kind of keeping the school safe is happening, that both things are important in thinking about sanctuary schools not as kind of islands upon themselves, but as a greater network of community organizations and people concerned with keeping immigrant students both safe and empowered to be welcome and happy, fulfilled members of our society.
I think that fully answers the question and really shows once again how schools can be built as places of sanctuary. And to close, we'll close on a real downer. I want to ask about the opposite. Of course, the United States is always anti-immigrant, and despite the national narrative of melting pot, kaleidoscope, however, these dominant notions can be framed, policy and action speak differently. So I want to just couch what I'm about to say in this idea that there is something specific happening in 2016 and something specific happening now, but this is not unique. It's not exceptional. So, you were researching and writing by and large during the first Trump administration, and speaking about sanctuary schools during that time. And people are reading your book during the second Trump administration and thinking about sanctuary schools in a moment where schools and other sensitive locations have legally been removed from that designation, that there is no sensitive locations policy anymore. So what does that mean? How do educators, how do researchers, how do activists still build schools as sanctuaries when those protections are stripped and not just taken away, but are taken away so that people on the move can be actively attacked and kidnapped? And
yeah, we just saw
yeah,
this like yesterday in Chicago with a preschool, right? It's so much worse. I mean, I write about the time period in which Trump was elected in the opening pages of the book. And I still do think that was very much a turning point. We've had highs and lows for immigrant communities in this country forever, but it was a real turning point in terms of the criminalization of immigration, and in particular, the repulsive mistreatment of people in detention, the privatization of detention and the money making around detention, I think is really important to note as part of that turning point. And so one of my questions when Trump was elected the second time, I rewrote the conclusion probably 3 times post-election because it was hard to know what to say at that point, right? We're not going to get immigration reform in the next 4 years, maybe not in the next decade. DACA is a thing of the past. There's no longer pathways for young people to have work authorizations. Things are really, really bad, and they're not going to get better for a while. And so, can schools still be sanctuary is the question that I would come back to. And what I've been seeing now and what teachers have said to me is they know that they're not going to be able to prevent every detention and every deportation. But what they're doing differently is that they are acknowledging them, they're fighting for their students and families that are facing those things, and then they are marking them rather than kind of pushing them under the rug. And so what I've been seeing, for example, is at one school, a family is self-deporting because they're so scared right now. And the student has finished all of their graduation requirements except for attendance at class. And so the school did 2 things. First, she's going to get her diploma. She's going to finish school, and they're doing that in a creative way using tools we learned during COVID to make sure that happens. And second, the family had a going away. I don't want to call it a celebration, but I think they tried to really, the teacher said it's supposed to be a celebration. It feels like a funeral. But the marking of the departures and the recognition of the impact that deportation and detention has not only on the person or the family or their immediate community impacted, but the entire school. And so, again, I think sanctuary is still morphing and changing, adapting to the moment. But if you think back to that, silencing the anti-immigrant rhetoric, they're still operating on the flip side of that. They're still speaking back to negative portrayals of immigrant students. They're still addressing things like detention and deportation in humanizing ways, and still acknowledging the value of all of their families, even when that means the families are leaving. So there's ways of still resisting, there's ways of still acknowledging humanity. And more teachers are kind of putting their bodies on the line. I just talked to an assistant principal who's going through the process of essentially adopting a student to be able to make it safer for him to be here. So there are stories and moments of hope and possibility and love and care that continue to exist in these schools and many, many other spaces as we survive this particularly difficult time in our country.
Hi. So, in your writing, there was one thing that really stood out to me, and it was when you were talking about how this specific community adapted during COVID-19. It was the quote that was teachers went as far as delivering food to students on bikes and accompanying students to the morgue to identify family members. And that kind of stopped me when I was reading because that's not something you usually hear, but it is truly a testament to how deep the community within the school runs and how welcoming and safe these students feel with their teachers and vice versa as well. It was something that was very touching, and unfortunately it seems very outlandish for many school spaces in the US, but I just wanted to comment on that because I thought it was amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was just kind of blown away with how the school reacted to COVID. And I want to be really clear, this is not like a perfect space. A journalist asked me, is it real? Is this fiction? No, it's a real place. And there's grumbles and tensions. And even with COVID, it was like, what's best for the students to come back or to stay home? And depending on how teachers had experienced really horrible things with students, they had very different perspectives on what was the best answer. But they were able to really kind of work through it with one another, work through it with students, and come back, I think, in some ways stronger. Now they're dealing with like AI and what that means for learning English and those kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, that's what they're always adapting to the moment. And when I say this kind of jokingly in the book, but like people also say like our school is a family, and I think that can be overused and very cliche. But there was sometimes not another way to describe it, because literally you walk in the front office and everyone has family in the school. Like alums come back to the school just to hang out. And then I did this one interview with the gym teacher really kind of late in the study, I think, because I didn't expect him to surprise me, which was probably not my best researcher moment. But he was like from Long Island, and he worked in finance, and then he coached sports. And I sat down to talk with him, and I think I asked him a question like, so what do you think is your most important job here? Or describe to me what your job is like here at this high school. And he got really emphatic about, I really love coaching and sports are important for kids. But like every teacher in the school, and he kind of like pounded the table, every teacher in the school is a literacy teacher. Every teacher in the school teaches writing. My mentees, I work really hard with them on their PBATs. And it's important that kids feel safe and loved here. And that's probably the most important thing that I do. And I just thought, wow, like if you can get a math and science teacher to say I'm a literacy teacher, that's a big deal, right? Like a lot of math teachers, I have so many stories of like, I'm not an English teacher. That's the E&L teacher's problem. I don't do that. I just teach math. I think humanities and language teachers sometimes are more open to it, but not always. And once you get the gym teacher and the paraprofessionals and the hall monitors to say like literacy is part of my job, caring for students is part of my job, that's paradigm shifting. That's sanctuary. And being the person that would be called if a student's parents were deported, helping identify somebody at a morgue, they are above and beyond, but they're all wrapped up in this idea of care and humanity that come first, far before English, which is just not typical.
My question really comes from a school setting that has like security guards and a built-in like in-school suspension in the basement, and this constant targeting of the same students, just causing quote unquote trouble. And how can a teacher create sanctuary? Like they really want to create sanctuary within their classroom, but that's kind of the school that they work in at that time. Like, is it possible for a teacher to kind of create sanctuary in their classroom when the whole school is built on that kind of institution of there's a security guard on every floor, you get thrown into in-school suspension, and discipline is treated pretty harshly?
There's so many documented cases of ISS and the E&L classes being in the basement or in the far trailers, right? Like we like physically show people, signal to people how much they belong in a school or not. I often juxtapose kind of the schoolscape at International High School with your traditional trophy case, your perfect attendance board, and your honor roll, right? Like that's how we show who's valued in a school. So I would actually say that that's probably the most common form of sanctuary is the sanctuary classroom. There's books like The Newcomers by Helen Throop, I think is the author, who writes about kind of newcomer classrooms. I think it's much harder. I think the work is harder, but often I think when students have that one adult in the school, when they have that classroom that they know they can go to feel safe, and sometimes it is the E&L classroom, but the mindset shifts that I talk about in my book were written with both whole schools and individual teachers in mind, which is why I write recommendations that go from kind of the individual level, which is like you as an individual teacher can engage your mutual aid groups and rapid response teams in your neighborhood to find out what resources are available for your particular students. And you can kind of think about the schoolscape or the components of the schoolscape you see in the book, how you can replicate them in your classroom. That whole restructuring of the classroom can definitely happen. And the relationship building, I think that might be the most important one or two. There's so many important ones, but I think if you can, one, slow down things for students, keep them kids as long as possible, Sometimes that means like asking them to stay a fifth year in high school, helping them create a schedule that works with their work schedule. That can happen at the individual school counselor level or a small group of people at a school. And then I think that caring and knowing for your students, I think in particular, sometimes we're scared to talk to our immigrant students about their stories and their histories. We've been told because of Plyler versus Doe and FERPA that we can't know their status. We can only know their language proficiency scores. And so therefore we're either too scared or too busy or too urgently trying to teach them English to learn their whole stories. And even in the book, The Newcomers, she talks about one of her roles as the researcher was to help the teacher learn the kids' stories and the value that the teacher found in knowing where the kids were coming from, what their migration journeys were like, and what their lived experience in the United States was. And so I think individual teachers in particular can shift their mindset from, I can't know my students, or I don't have time to know my students, to let me know my students and try to make the curriculum in the classroom and the community of care around them reflect the things that I talk about in this book, as much as possible, given the constraints of the school, right? So again, I think it goes back to that creative compliance or non-compliance. But yes, it's possible. It's very hard work. All of this is hard work, unfortunately. But I think, the individual classroom is an incredibly important place in many schools.
I think what Sarah said, like also at the school that I work at, I've worked there for 2 years now, and the kids who quote unquote have higher intensity disabilities, I don't even know where those classrooms are. Like they're not on the maps that they give the subs. And I've never seen sub positions put out for those teachers. I don't even know those teachers' names. And so I've worked in a couple of their SPED classrooms, but some of them I've been around the whole building and I have no idea where these kids are. I only see them when they have like events in the gym. And I'm kind of just like, how is this acceptable? Like, where are they? But
Yeah.
it makes me think of cuts to like disability education and the stripping of those funds. Like, what would sanctuary look like for students with disabilities? Would that look like their own school? What changes could be made to a specific classroom? Because there are so many different debates about segregating students versus is it a sanctuary? But what changes could we make, because these students are being incredibly underserved in so many areas, and it's becoming harder and harder to make sanctuary for them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, we use that word marginalization. It's literally pushed to the margin. We see it in the schools. I hope that some of the lessons from the book are helpful for thinking about sanctuary for all kids who are marginalized, and particularly in high schools. I think when I talk to school leaders, for example, I encourage them to think about how they would audit their school to really realize, who's represented, who's valued. When we, as anthropologists, we talk about how people orient themselves to the world through symbols and routines and traditions, and that grammar of schooling that we have in the United States sets up the marginalization process by only valuing people who can conform to kind of white normative middle class values. And if you can't, you are, for a lot of immigrant students, not even permitted to enroll, pushed to the margins before you're pushed out, framed as a problem to be solved or a challenge, or allowed to simply disappear. And that's what we're seeing a lot of right now. So the whole school model, or the segregation question, is one that's really of interest to me, because I haven't seen a great example, it doesn't mean it's not out there, of a school in which immigrant kids aren't segregated, right? So they could be at the same school, but if they're segregated in E&L classrooms for 5 periods a day and not allowed to do any of the enrichment classes because there's simply no time based on the way that it is set up, that is segregation and a form of isolation. And then I hear stories every day of teachers who don't know what to do with their newcomer kids, and so they stick them in the corner desk or corner table with iPads to translate their work or do the translated work. That's isolation and segregation too. So I think in an ideal society, in a utopic society, these schools wouldn't need to exist. But I think there's a strong argument for the sanctuary schools for all marginalized youth and meeting their needs to exist, as long as these grammars of schooling continue to dominate and we aren't thinking about what shifts are necessary to create more opportunity and possibility for kids who don't fit that white middle class normative profile.
Today's episode was produced by the Education, Genocide, Liberation class. If you like our podcast, please like, subscribe, follow us wherever you listen. You can also find us on Instagram, where another ed is possible. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.